The Emberfield rest stop, a serene haven on a desolate stretch of highway, was on the verge of hosting an unexpected event. Michael Winston, a battle-hardened Marine, had just stopped for a brief coffee break, unaware that he was about to encounter a different kind of battle. His sharp instincts were triggered upon noticing a young black girl and an older white man, signaling that something was amiss. Yet, in a world where looks often mislead, could Michael be certain? What hidden threats lingered beneath this ordinary scene at the rest stop? Let's delve into this, but first, comment below to let us know where you're tuning in from today, and if you're intrigued by this gripping story, don't forget to hit subscribe. As dusk approached, casting long shadows over the quiet rural highway that sliced through Emberfield, a modest rest stop appeared on the horizon, a beacon for tired travelers. This lone building, with its simple diner and store, offered a short reprieve from the road's monotony. Inside, the atmosphere was tranquil, the hum of fluorescent lights blending with the soft clinks of cutlery and subdued conversations. Faded booths told stories of many who had come and gone, while a coffee station and vending machines stood ready in the corner. Upon Michael Winston's entry, a few patrons glanced up, gauging the new arrival. As a Marine, Michael assessed his surroundings with efficiency. Despite being stateside, his military vigilance remained. His survey of the diner's patrons, a few truckers, an elderly woman, and a businessman, was interrupted by a sight at a yellow booth by the window. A young girl, around 8, in a stark red dress, sat across from the suited man. Her anxious demeanor and furtive glances added layers of doubt to Michael's mind about her safety. Michael ordered his coffee, his thoughts entangled with the scene. The stark contrast between the man's calm demeanor and the girl's discomfort suggested a story deeper than surface appearances. Perhaps she was adopted or a family friend, Michael reasoned, but the mismatched duo's dynamics kept his suspicions alive. Stationed near the vending machines with his coffee, Michael continued his discreet watch. The girl's subtle, possibly distressful gestures and her fleeting, fearful glances met Michael's, intensifying his concern. He was stuck between intervening and respecting privacy, yet he couldn't ignore his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The more he watched, the more Michael felt the urgency of the situation. The girl's tentative gestures, possibly a distress signal, and the man's overly watchful eyes led Michael to trust his gut. Something was indeed amiss. As the tension built, Michael remained vigilant, his military training preparing him for whatever might unfold next in this quiet diner at the Emberfield rest stop. But Michael couldn't dismiss the nagging thought that it was all a facade, a carefully crafted mask of normalcy concealing something much darker. As the minutes ticked away, he found himself wrestling internally. Should he step in and inquire if everything was all right? But what if he was mistaken? What if his intervention brought about needless distress? The burden of decision weighed heavily on him, his military instincts urging him to act, while his civilian caution advised restraint. Opting to bide his time, Michael resolved to keep watching. If the girl signaled again, if any definitive signs of distress emerged, then he would step in. Until then, he remained on alert, ready to respond instantly. Standing on the precipice of action and inaction, Michael couldn't help but ponder the unpredictable twists of life. Just days earlier, he had been navigating the clear, present dangers of a war zone. Now back on American soil, he found himself embroiled in a different kind of confrontation, one where the boundaries between correct and excessive action blurred frustratingly. Time stretched on as he maintained his vigilant watch. The initial surge of adrenaline had ebbed, replaced by a constant, buzzing tension. Knowing he couldn't just stand indefinitely with an empty coffee cup without drawing suspicion, Michael decided to engage more naturally with his surroundings. Approaching the counter, he muttered to the waitress, "I'll take a sandwich and some snacks for the road," keeping his voice low and even. As he waited, his gaze inadvertently drifted back to the peculiar duo. This time, however, The dynamics had subtly shifted. The girl's hands remained on the table, her eyes now cast downward, no longer flitting about the room. Significantly, she didn't repeat the hand signal that had so captured Michael's attention earlier. Watching closely, Michael observed the man lean forward, whispering something to the girl. The words were too faint for Michael to catch, but their effect on the girl was clear and immediate. Her small frame tensed, her shoulders curling inward as if to make herself even smaller. The man's gaze never wavered from the girl, intense and possessive, a predatory gleam that clashed with his outward calm demeanor. As the waitress returned with his order, Michael began to doubt his initial suspicions. Perhaps he was overthinking. Maybe his military experience had skewed his perception, seeing threats where none existed. After all, this was just a public diner off the highway. Could anything truly sinister occur here in plain view? He tried to dismiss the uneasy feeling in his gut, telling himself it was probably nothing, a family simply enjoying a quiet meal. The girl might just be shy, uncomfortable around strangers, and the man's domineering presence could be explained as protective concern, couldn't it? Yet, despite his attempts to rationalize, Michael couldn't fully convince himself. The memory of the girl's distress signal, the fleeting fear in her eyes, the unnatural stillness of her now, these details formed a picture he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wished to. As he picked up his food, ready to leave, Michael was torn. His instincts screamed that something was amiss, that the girl needed help. But doubt clouded his judgment. What if he was wrong? What if he caused a scene over nothing? The weight of indecision bore down on him as he stood there, sandwich in hand, caught between his desire to assist and his fear of overstepping. He knew he should continue on his way. He had places to be, after all. Yet, something held him back, an inability to turn away from the unsettling feeling that he was witnessing something profoundly wrong. As he deliberated, Michael's gaze returned to the girl. There she sat, small and vulnerable against the drab backdrop of the diner. Despite her outward stillness, there was a palpable tension in her posture, the kind anticipating the worst, braced for an impact at any moment. The man, seemingly oblivious to Michael's scrutiny, continued his routine, sipping coffee, rustling his newspaper, and occasionally glancing at the girl with that same unsettling intensity. To an onlooker, they might appear as just another incongruent pair, perhaps a guardian and his charge, or a family friend with a timid child. But Michael was no casual observer. His training compelled him to look deeper, to notice the subtle cues that others might overlook, and everything he observed confirmed that this situation was far from ordinary. Standing there, food in hand, Michael faced a crossroads. He could leave, convincing himself he was mistaken, that his battle-sharpened senses were misfiring in this tranquil setting. Or he could stay, keep watching, and be prepared to act if his suspicions proved correct. The decision weighed heavily on him, knowing that if he walked away now, he might never forgive himself if something happened to the girl. But if he stayed, if he involved himself in what might be a perfectly innocent scenario, he risked causing undue trouble and embarrassment. Ultimately, it wasn't really a choice at all. Michael knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he was absolutely certain that the girl was safe. He might be overreacting, seeing shadows where none existed, but he had to be sure. But Michael preferred to face the embarrassment of being wrong rather than live with the guilt of having done nothing if he was right. As he moved towards the exit, his steps slow and deliberate, Michael kept his senses sharp. He wasn't truly leaving. Rather, he was repositioning himself, ready for whatever might unfold in this increasingly disturbing scenario. His hand clasped the door handle, the cool metal contrasting sharply with the diner's warmth. He paused, his body halfway turned toward the exit, lingering in that liminal space between departing and staying. Compelled to take one last look, Michael cast a final glance over his shoulder at the girl in the red dress. In that moment, Time seemed to stretch. The girl's hand rose, palm facing outward, fingers spread. The same gesture he had noticed before, but this time its intent was unmistakable. Her eyes, wide and filled with desperation, met his. In that brief instant of connection, Michael saw a silent plea, a cry for help that he couldn't ignore. The realization struck him powerfully. This wasn't merely a shy girl having lunch with her guardian. There was something much darker at play, something that sent chills down Michael's spine. Seeing the fear in her eyes, the tension in her small frame, and the silent desperation of her gesture, all of Michael's doubts and hesitations vanished. His military instincts took over, his mind shifting into high alert. He couldn't simply walk away now, not after seeing the clear signs of distress. The girl needed help, and he might be the only one able to provide it. Releasing the door handle, Michael made his decision. He turned back towards the diner, his posture straightening, his jaw set with resolve. Though he had left the battlefield behind, his instinct to protect, to defend those unable to defend themselves, was ingrained deeply within him. As he strode back into the diner, Michael's mind raced with options. He couldn't just take the girl and run. That would cause chaos and potentially put her in more danger. He needed to assess the situation more closely before acting. His eyes stayed fixed on the girl as he moved, vigilant for any sign of immediate danger. The man across from her seemed unaware of the silent exchange that had just occurred, his attention still on his newspaper, but his shoulders tensed, a stillness that hinted at barely contained aggression. Michael's heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins, as he approached what he knew could be a volatile situation. But he couldn't turn back now, not with the memory of the girl's pleading eyes and the desperation in her silent gesture fueling his resolve. He was committed to seeing this through. Approaching the table, Michael noticed the girl's eyes widen with a mix of hope and fear. The man, sensing movement, looked up from his newspaper. Surprise flickered across his face before he composed himself, his features settling into a mask of polite inquiry. Michael, searching for the right words and approach, knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could escalate the situation, putting the girl in even greater danger. Yet, he also knew he couldn't hesitate. His years of military training screamed that this child needed help, and she needed it now. With measured steps, Michael closed the distance to the table. His posture was relaxed yet alert, projecting a calm authority that belied the tension coiling within his muscles. He towered over the table, his presence commanding yet non-threatening. The man's eyes briefly widened in shock, clearly caught off guard by the sudden approach of the soldier, disrupting whatever plans he might have had. Michael's gaze shifted between the man and the girl, reading their reactions. The contrast was stark. The man's face was a mask of forced casualness, while the girl seemed to shrink further into herself, her eyes darting nervously between the two men. "Is everything okay here?" Michael asked, his voice steady and direct, directing the question more at the girl than the man. Michael kept both Greg and the girl within his peripheral vision, remaining alert for any sudden moves. Greg responded first, his voice smooth yet tinged with a hint of tension he couldn't completely mask. "Everything's fine," he asserted, trying to sound casual, though his eyes betrayed his wariness. "We're just taking a break, that's all." "Why? Is there a problem, soldier?" His question carried a subtle challenge, probing whether Michael suspected anything amiss. But Michael wasn't easily swayed. His focus turned fully towards Zoe, softening his posture as he bent down to her level and asked gently yet firmly, "Is this true?" His eyes intently searched hers for any signs that might affirm or dispel his concerns. Zoe hesitated, her eyes nervously flitting between Greg and Michael. Seemingly trapped between fear and a desperate hope for rescue, she finally nodded slowly after a fleeting glance at Greg. Her confirmation was stiff and robotic. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yet her hesitation only deepened Michael's unease. Acknowledging her response with a slight nod, Michael stepped back, appearing satisfied. He turned and walked towards the door, giving the impression he was leaving. Greg called out to him as he departed, his voice overly cheerful in an attempt to sustain the facade of normalcy. "Thanks for your service," he said, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. However, Michael wasn't deceived. As he moved towards the exit, his instincts sharpened. The girl's hesitant nod, the forced nature of her response, and the controlled environment Greg had established, all confirmed Michael's initial suspicions that Zoe needed help. His doubt had now turned into grim determination. Michael pushed the diner's door open, stepping into the cool evening air. The parking lot was quiet, a few cars scattered, their surfaces reflecting the dim overhead lights. He walked towards his vehicle with purpose, his movements casual yet vigilant to any observer. Michael was far from relaxed. Every sense was on high alert, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. As he reached his car, he didn't get in. Instead, he positioned himself to keep a clear view of the diner's exit, his military training emphasizing the importance of strategic positioning. With swift, practiced movements, Michael pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As the operator answered, his voice was low and urgent. "I need to report a possible child abduction," he stated, his words clipped and precise. "I'm at the Emberfield rest stop off Highway 27. There's a young black girl, about 8 years old, wearing a red dress. She's with an older white man, early 50s, in a navy suit. The girl seems distressed and may have tried to signal for help." He provided detailed descriptions of both Zoe and Greg, highlighting the girl's apparent fear and the man's controlling behavior. "I'm a former Marine," he added, hoping it would lend credibility to his report. "Something's not right here. This girl needs help." As he spoke, Michael's eyes never left the diner's entrance. He was acutely aware that Greg might decide to leave at any moment, especially if he sensed that Michael's concern was more than casual. His body was tense, ready to spring into action if necessary. The operator assured him that the police were on their way and urged him to stay safe and not intervene directly unless the child was in immediate danger. Michael acknowledged the instruction, but internally he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to keep Zoe safe. As he ended the call, he settled into a watchful waiting. The minutes crawled by, each second stretching into eternity. He held his breath, straining to catch any movement from inside the diner. Then he saw it. Through the large windows, he could see Greg rising from his seat and reaching for his jacket. Zoe remained seated, her small form almost lost in the booth. Michael's heart raced as he watched Greg roughly grab Zoe's arm, pulling her to her feet. Just as Michael was about to rush back into the diner, the welcome sound of sirens approached. Relief washed over him as he saw 2 police cars pulling into the rest stop parking lot, their lights flashing. Without hesitation, Michael sprinted towards the diner, the police officers close behind. As they burst through the doors, Michael's eyes immediately locked onto Greg and Zoe. Greg had been dragging Zoe towards the exit, but at the sight of Michael and the officers, he froze. The color drained from his face, his confident facade crumbling instantly. Panic replaced the controlled demeanor he had maintained earlier. Zoe's eyes widened, a mix of fear and hope flashing across her face as Greg's grip on her arm tightened reflexively. In that chaotic moment, Michael knew the real confrontation was just beginning. The next few minutes would determine Zoe's fate, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure her safety. The diner, once a place of quiet routine, had transformed into a scene of tense confrontation. The few patrons present watched in stunned silence as the drama unfolded before them, the air crackling with tension. All eyes were focused on the tableau near the exit. Greg, his face a mask of barely contained panic, Zoe, frozen in place and trembling, and Michael, standing shoulder to shoulder with the police officers, his posture radiating determination. "Sir, let go of the girl and step back," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm but measured. The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Greg seemed paralyzed, his grip on Zoe's arm tightening reflexively. For a moment, nobody moved, the only sound being the soft whimper that escaped Zoe's lips, a sound that tore at Michael's heart. He watched Greg closely, ready to intervene if the man made any sudden moves. Finally, Greg's paralysis broke. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking as he released Zoe's arm and tried to backtrack. "She's my niece. We were just leaving, that's all." His eyes flicked between Michael and the officers, searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. Michael could see the fear in Greg's eyes, the realization that he had been caught. But more importantly, he saw Zoe. The little girl stood rooted to the spot, trembling, her eyes darting between Greg and Michael. She looked on the verge of tears, caught between the fear of her captor and the uncertainty of what would happen next. One of the officers moved closer to Greg, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "We've received reports of suspicious behavior." As the officers began questioning Greg about his relationship with the child, Michael's attention stayed fixed on Zoe. He took a subtle step forward, positioning himself as a buffer between her and Greg, aiming to ease her anxiety without causing further alarm. "You're safe now," he reassured her softly, his voice both low and firm. Zoe looked up at him, her eyes wide with a blend of fear and hope. Meanwhile, Greg's composure unraveled as he struggled to furnish any solid proof of his relationship with Zoe. With every passing second, his narrative grew more disjointed and his desperation more palpable. Michael observed the officers exchanging glances, their suspicions intensifying as they moved toward a decision, weighing the implausible explanations against the evidence unfolding before them. Throughout this ordeal, Zoe remained silent, her small frame tensed with anxiety. Michael yearned to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right, but he knew the most crucial support he could offer now was ensuring Greg faced accountability. As the questioning wore on, the officers' doubts clearly escalated. They subtly shifted their body language, preparing to take control of the situation as Greg's eyes desperately scanned the diner, looking for any possible escape. However, he found himself cornered, the impending consequences of his actions closing in. Finally, one of the officers knelt down to Zoe's level and gently asked, "Sweetheart, can you tell us who this man is to you? Are you okay?" Zoe's voice quivered as she finally found the courage to speak. "I need help," she whispered, her body shaking. "I'm in danger." Each word seemed to cost her immensely, a struggle against her profound fear. With Zoe's plea and Greg's failure to prove any legitimate connection to her, the officers decided to act. "Sir, you're under arrest," one officer announced, moving to handcuff Greg. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Greg's protests intensified as the reality of his situation dawned on him. "This is a mistake. You don't understand," he shouted, but his objections were ignored. The officers led him out of the diner, his cries diminishing as they placed him in the back of a police car. Inside the diner, Zoe stood alone, visibly relieved yet still frightened. Michael stayed close, a constant presence amid the upheaval. As the officers began to question Zoe more gently, Michael recognized that this was just the beginning of a lengthy process to ensure justice was served. For now, he allowed himself a moment of relief. The immediate danger Zoe had faced was averted. Observing the officers comforting Zoe, Michael felt reassured that his decision to act, guided by instinct, had indeed made a crucial difference. The diner, once a site of tense confrontation, had quieted down. The few remaining patrons whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Zoe and the unfolding situation. Outside, the police car lights cast a rhythmic glow of red and blue across the parking lot. Inside one of those cars, Greg sat handcuffed, his previous assertiveness completely evaporated as he made a series of desperate pleas, unnoticed by the officers who had already made their decision. Greg was headed to the station. Back inside, the focus shifted entirely to Zoe. She sat in a booth with a kind-faced female officer beside her, speaking softly in tones too low for Michael to overhear. Despite the officer's gentle demeanor, Zoe's eyes continued to dart around, as if fearing Greg's return at any moment. Another officer approached Michael. "Sir, we're going to need a statement from you. Can you tell us exactly what you observed that aroused your suspicions?" Michael nodded, his military training aiding him as he provided a detailed, precise account of the hand signals, the girl's evident distress, and the man's controlling behavior. "You did the right thing by calling us," the officer remarked once Michael had finished. "Too many people would have looked the other way, convinced themselves it was nothing. You may well have saved that little girl's life." Those words struck Michael deeply. He had acted on instinct, driven by a sense that something was terribly wrong, but hearing the officer affirm the impact of his actions brought the gravity of the situation into stark relief. Michael acknowledged the officer's words with a nod as the officer returned to confer with his colleagues. Michael's gaze returned to Zoe. In the large booth, she looked small and vulnerable, her bright red dress stark against the diner's subdued colors. Despite the comforting presence of the female officer, Zoe's eyes remained watchful, her body tensed as if still bracing for the worst. As they prepared to leave for the police station, an officer placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "We'd appreciate it if you could come down to the station as well. We'll need a formal statement, and well, you seem to have a calming effect on the girl." Michael agreed, his eyes meeting Zoe's. Offering her a reassuring smile, she seemed to relax slightly as they all filed out of the diner. The gravity of the situation settled over them as they drove toward the police station. What had begun as a suspicious encounter in a highway diner had unraveled into a grave matter, and as they approached the police station, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over. Inside the bustling station, officers moved purposefully, their low conversations punctuated by the occasional phone ring or keyboard clack. In one corner, Greg sat handcuffed, his former confidence shattered as the officers dug into his background, seeking any clues that might clarify his relationship with Zoe. Despite his continued protests, "I'm her father," he insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. The officers were unmoved, focusing on verifying the facts and ensuring Zoe's safety. But his pleas were ignored as the officers pressed on with their investigation. Hours unfolded with background checks and intense questioning, heightening the tension within the station as unsettling truths began to surface. Initially, minor inconsistencies appeared in Greg's account, but as the inquiry deepened, a shocking reality was unveiled. Greg was not Zoe's biological father, but her stepfather, recently married to Zoe's mother. This revelation sent shockwaves through the station. Greg had no legal authority over Zoe. He had no right to have taken her from her school that day. But the alarming revelations didn't end there. Further investigation revealed that Zoe's mother had lost custody of her daughter months earlier after a contentious court battle, with Zoe's biological father being granted full custody, a critical detail Greg had conveniently left out. It became evident that Greg, in collusion with Zoe's mother, had abducted Zoe from her daycare, planning to flee the country and evade the court's custody decision. The gravity of their plan, highlighted by documents found in Greg's possession, underscored a dire scenario. Zoe was nearly smuggled out of the country, never to be seen again. The realization sent a chill through everyone involved as officer faces grew grim, understanding the magnitude of the crisis they had averted. Amidst this tense backdrop, The police station's door swung open abruptly. A man, Zoe's biological father, rushed in, his expression a mix of worry and relief. He had been oblivious to the abduction, typically picking Zoe up after work. However, a distressing call from the police had upended his day. His eyes frantically searched the room until they found Zoe, sitting near a desk, appearing small and lost. "Zoe!" he exclaimed, his voice cracking with emotion. At the sound of her father's voice, Zoe's head snapped up, and upon seeing him, her face lit up with recognition and relief. "Daddy!" she cried out, sprinting toward him. Her father knelt down, enveloping her in his arms, his eyes brimming with tears as he whispered reassurances. "I've got you now, you're safe," his voice thick with emotion. Zoe clung to him tightly, her tears of relief soaking his shirt. Michael, who had been providing a detailed account to an officer, stepped back to give the reunited family space. He observed as Zoe buried her face in her father's chest, her body trembling not with fear but with relief. Meanwhile, Greg was escorted to a holding cell, his initial protests now reduced to subdued pleas for leniency. The harsh reality of his actions had sunk in, visibly crushing his resolve. As the night progressed, Michael felt a profound relief. Watching Zoe safe in her father's arms, he knew his decision to trust his instincts had been correct. Reflecting on the evening's events, he realized how a simple stop for coffee had led him to a pivotal role in a dramatic crisis, highlighting that significant battles often occur not overseas but at home, in the moments when we choose to act rather than turn away. The chaos at the police station eventually gave way to a more structured process. Michael had spent hours recounting his observations, aiding the officers in building a solid case. Meanwhile, Zoe, with her father's support, had provided testimony that not only supported Michael's account, but also added crucial details against Greg and her mother. As the formalities concluded, Zoe's father approached Michael, gratitude evident despite his exhausted, tear-stained appearance. But their eyes shone with immense gratitude. "I can't even begin to thank you," the father said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You saved my little girl. I can't imagine what might have happened if you hadn't intervened." Michael, ever modest, simply shook his head. "There's no need for thanks," he responded, his voice filled with sincerity. "This is what I was trained to do. It's about protecting people, especially children. I couldn't just stand by and watch." However, the father wasn't content with leaving it at that. The significance of Michael's actions for his family was too profound to be left without recognition. "I have to repay you somehow," he insisted, his tone earnest. "You saved my daughter's life, and I owe you everything. It doesn't matter what it takes. I need to do something for you." Michael, uncomfortable with the praise, tried to brush it off. "I did what anyone should do in that situation." "You don't owe me anything," he said, trying to downplay his role. Yet, the father persisted, his gratitude undiminished. "Please, at least come to a barbecue," he suggested, managing a small smile amidst his emotional turmoil. "Come to our place this weekend. You're practically family now." His expression then turned serious once more. "Plus, I need to explain more about Zoe's mother and why it was so crucial for you to be at the rest stop that day. There's more to this story than you know." Despite Michael's initial reluctance, the father's insistence and the promise of more information led him to reconsider. "All right," Michael finally agreed, a slight smile appearing. "I'll come." The father's face brightened with Michael's acceptance, signaling more than just an invitation accepted. It marked a bond forged through crisis, a connection beyond the usual ties that bind strangers. As they prepared to leave, a disturbance occurred in the hallway. Greg was being escorted from the interrogation room to a holding cell, and as he passed through the main area, his eyes locked with those of Zoe's father. The tension in the room spiked instantly. Keeping his composure for Zoe's sake, who was dozing in a chair nearby, the father stepped closer to Greg. In a low, controlled voice filled with unmistakable intensity, he said, "You and her," referring to Zoe's mother, "won't get away with this." Greg, pale and visibly defeated, said nothing, his confident demeanor having completely dissolved. The father continued, his voice cold but purposeful, "You thought you could steal her from me, but you were wrong. There's going to be a legal battle, and I'll make sure you both get what you deserve. She's my daughter, and you won't hurt her again." Greg remained silent, the reality of his actions and their consequences finally dawning on him. Without waiting for a reply, the father turned back to Zoe, his demeanor softening as he approached his daughter, careful not to let any of the anger he felt towards Greg affect his interactions with her. As dawn broke through the station windows, Michael prepared to leave. He exchanged contact details with Zoe's father, affirming his attendance at the upcoming barbecue. As he exited the police station, Michael found himself contemplating the backstory involving Zoe's mother and the desperate circumstances leading up to the attempted abduction. He knew that soon, at a simple backyard barbecue, he would discover the full extent of the story that had brought them all together on that eventful night. The barbecue day was filled with the aroma of grilling meat and the sound of laughter, a stark contrast to the recent turmoil. Michael, standing near the grill with a drink in hand, felt slightly out of place despite the festive environment. His gaze eventually settled on Zoe, who was happily playing with other children. Her laughter, so different from the scared child he had first encountered, brought a smile to his face. "It's good to see her like this, isn't it?" Zoe's father remarked, joining Michael with a reflective smile. "It is," Michael agreed softly, watching Zoe play. "She seems happy." The father nodded, his expression becoming serious. "You know, I never imagined we'd end up in a situation like this," he began, his voice low. "Life can take such unexpected turns." He paused, shaking his head slightly. "I'm just grateful you were there that night. There's so much more to this story that I need to tell you." Michael listened intently as the father continued, his curiosity piqued. They moved to a quieter part of the yard, away from the celebration. "There's something you should know," the father said quietly, glancing towards the house. He explained the bitter custody battle, the concerns about the mother's stability, and the court's decision to grant him full custody. "She didn't take it well," he admitted, his voice lowering further. "There were threats, but I never thought she'd actually try to take Zoe." The father paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "The police found evidence they were planning to leave the country. If they had made it out—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the pain of the potential loss evident in his expression. Michael felt a chill, realizing just how pivotal his intervention had been.